Hello and welcome. My name is Douglas Comer, and I'm president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. We are now using as our public name World Heritage USA. This name conveys our goals and objectives more clearly than our previous public name of US ICOMOS. The title of our webinar today is National Park Leaders as World Heritage Stewards from Canada, Mexico, and the USA. We're very honored to have with us Ernesto Enkerlin-Hoeflich, former head of protected areas in Mexico, Jon Jarvis and Robert G. Stanton, former directors of the U.S. National Park Service, and Alan Latourelle, former chief executive officer of Parks Canada. I invite you to note in what they say, you will hear references to one of the goals of World Heritage that is better reflected in our new name. The goal is to bring to the attention of the public that heritage must attend to the inextricable connection among what we commonly term nature and what we commonly term culture, and the role, especially, that Indigenous heritage groups play in promoting and nurturing that connection. They are, in fact, de facto stewards of vast tracts of the global landscape that are essential to reducing and hopefully ultimately reversing the course of climate change. It's not too much to say that repairing the relationship between what we have called nature and culture would determine the fate of humanity. It bears emphasizing that the term nature itself is a cultural construction, as many scholars, including historians and anthropologists, have written about for decades. But as fundamental as this concept is to the existential environmental crisis that we face, it really has not found its way into popular thinking to the extent that it must in order to further change environmental policies and industrial practices. In North America, as in all of the Americas in the Western Hemisphere, we are only now engaging with the problematic legacy of colonialism. One of the artifacts of colonialism is the displacement of indigenous populations from their traditional homelands, and then not heeding their voices since then. This has occurred in the countries where the three national park systems you will hear about today are located, and each of these systems are now taking serious steps to repair the damage done. What we have seen in recent past centuries is the loss of connection between humans and the rest of the living world that is fundamental to essentially all indigenous cultures have this. The stories that are told to children in these cultures emphasize how humans emerge from the landscape itself and how they continue to be tied to the landscape. They include expressions of kinship with other species, a kinship that is described in anthropological literature as totemism. Certain groups, often termed clans, consider themselves kin to a certain species and are morally obliged to protect that species. This forms a network of species protectors, driven by the knowledge that all species in the network, including humans, are mutually dependent upon each other. By taking responsibility for all of the various species that are essential to the ecosystem in which they live, they protect the future of that ecosystem and thus their own survival. And this is what we must do globally. This is something, however, we've lost. It seems a foreign concept to many people who have gone through our own educational system. And this loss represents an existential threat to us all. So with that, I would like to introduce Destry Jarvis, Vice President of World Heritage USA, who will moderate today's session. And this is one that I'm sure you'll find fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Doug. Welcome, everybody. We'll begin. We'll take each speaker individually. I'll introduce them, then we'll come back together with all four speakers for a discussion and answer any of your questions that you post in the chat. We begin with Alan Latourelle, who as CEO of Parks Canada oversaw the expansion of that century-old organization by 30% and the addition of 10 new national parks and marine conservation areas. Under his leadership, Parks Canada became an international leader in working collaboratively with Indigenous people. He led the implementation of the most significant ecological restoration program in the organization's history through establishment of Canada's first national urban park in the Greater Toronto area. He received the IUCN's Fred Packard Award and the 2014 World Parks Congress for his extraordinary contributions. He also led efforts to secure a $3 billion federal investment in Parks Canada infrastructure, the largest in their 104-year history. He was in 2018, he was awarded the Order of Canada, the country's highest level of recognition. Alan, glad you're here. Take it over.
Well, thank you very much, and Destry. It's a real pleasure and an honor, and it's nice to reconnect with friends, with Jon and Ernesto and Bob. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to talk briefly about leadership, because when you look at people that will be speaking next, I'm very humble because these three individuals have been exceptional leaders in their countries. They were great leaders because they had a passion for their country. They cared deeply for their national treasures, and they shared that passion with their teams and their colleagues nationally, but more importantly, they also made a significant contribution internationally. And to achieve what they've achieved, they had the courage to dream, but more importantly, they had really this ability to ingrain that dream in the hearts and minds of others, to achieve exceptional goals for their country. So again, I want to salute Bob, Jon, and Ernesto. I'll move to the first slide in terms of World Heritage. So I'll speak today about World Heritage, speak about collaboration with the US and Mexico, and then finally speak about the future. So when we think about World Heritage, in Canada, we have 20 World Heritage sites. Parks Canada is involved directly in the management of 12 of them. These are exceptional places, both culturally and naturally. These are our nation's gift to humanity, so Canada's gift to humanity, but they're also international treasures. They are the places that we as leaders in the parks programs are entrusted to protect and present for current and future generations. And those are some of the most cherished from an economic perspective places for people, international visitors to come and experience. But I think there's a dark side to all of this as we move forward historically with creating all of these national parks, especially national parks, is we've left behind Indigenous people, and I'll touch on that a bit later. The next slide is really about speaking about, so we'll move to the third slide. In terms of World Heritage, the other point I'd like to make is that we as countries have a responsibility to share our expertise, share our knowledge, share our capacity with other countries so we can all strive, and the whole network of World Heritage sites internationally can be sustained for future generations. When we look at this spirit of collaboration within Canada, US, Mexico, we have the joint World Heritage sites, for example, the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park with the US, just to name one. Jon and I, Ernesto, were fortunate to be part of a great team of leaders that have put together the North American Wilderness and Protected Area Committee to really look at it from a North American perspective, some of the key challenges, opportunities in conservation and parks and sites management to achieve common goals. We've also all led and chaired the World Protected Area Leadership Forum, which is an opportunity for internationally for leaders of park organizations to develop the agenda for the next decade, to really discuss common challenges and issues, but more importantly, to find solutions that are shareable, although we operate within different social or political contexts. But it's also through these types of programs where we've been able to, for example, at the Quebec 32nd World Heritage Committee or at the Sydney World Park Congress, to really make leaps and bounds in terms of engaging Indigenous peoples and youth in terms of this international dialogue as we move forward. As I look at some of the challenges and opportunities that we are facing, from a World Heritage perspective, they're numerous and they're challenging, but I think that we have the opportunity by working collaboratively in North America and internationally to make a real difference for future generations. We'll move to the next slide. The National Historic Sites, or the cultural fabric of our countries, is often forgotten. National parks, and I would say generally speaking, get a lot more prominence internationally when you look at the role of ICOMOS versus IUCN, and the funding, you can see a huge difference. And I think that because of all of that, we've seen a significant loss in the heritage fabric of our National Historic Sites, World Heritage Sites that are cultural. So that's one of the key challenges that we need to stop that degradation as we look at the future. Healing broken connections. A lot of these national parks especially were established by basically kicking out or excluding completely and trying to, in fact, change culture of Indigenous people. Some of the most personal and deep experiences that I've lived as head of Parks Canada is hearing from elders that have been that have seen as parks were created, for example, in Riding Mountain National Park, as they were being thrown out of the area that their traditional territory was in to establish the park. Their houses were being burned as they were walking out of that park area. And we can think about Torngat Mountains National Park Reserve, which close to it has Hebron, where the Labrador Inuit community was forcibly removed from that community and relocated against their will. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of hurt, but there's a lot of opportunities for healing these broken connections when leaders take their role seriously, and when organizations and institutions like the U.S. National Park Service, Mexico, and Canada, when we can make a difference. The loss of biodiversity is well documented. Everybody talks about it consistently. It's in the press almost every day. And the impact of climate change, but not only climate change in terms of our national park, but parks, but climate change in terms of cultural resources, and the risk to cultural resources need to be stressed. We're faced with external development pressures that we're all facing outside of our boundaries. And as mentioned previously, connecting the hearts and minds of, in our case, Canadians, to their World Heritage Site, to their parks and sites, to develop this sense of pride, this sense of commitment to protecting these places for future generations is still a challenge, an ongoing challenge, and something that we need to pay attention to. As we look forward to, we have a lot of the challenges, but I think that we have some of the key skills and expertise and will to make a difference as we move forward. I think previously I spoke about the challenges and the experiences I've had with Indigenous communities that were expelled from park areas. But I've also been blessed to work with Indigenous leaders and communities where we've seen that we can make a difference. And I'll just use a practical example. In the Waihanish National Park Reserve and Haida Heritage Site, I was privileged to be part of a group that raised a totem pole in that park for the first time in 100 years, and celebrating that with the community and the cultural spirit that you could feel at that event. I've been privileged to establish several national parks that are cooperatively managed with Indigenous peoples. Although those are success stories, those are only the start. I think Parks Canada since then have continued in terms of their relationship and pushing the envelope in terms of working with Indigenous communities and healing those broken connections. Governments in Canada have spoken about reconciliation. Well, in Parks Canada, reconciliation with Indigenous communities started with Tom Lee, my predecessor, who was a great Canadian and great visionary to really start by introducing initially the Aboriginal Indigenous committee that was made up of elders and chiefs to really help us in Parks Canada in really turning the tide in terms of a relationship. I think as we look at the future and the challenges we face, we need leaders that care. We need leaders that care about these places. We need leaders that cares about their people, their team, and people that care about Indigenous people and the citizens of our countries. We need common vision so we can look at, instead of looking at nature and culture as two separate elements, to really see them as intertwined. Indigenous people don't see it as nature and culture. They are part of nature. And more in Canada, we are operating that way. But I think we need to push the envelope. And also at the World Heritage Committee, we've had some challenges in terms of some Canadian nominations of culture and nature intertwined. And I think that there's quite a bit of work that's still needed internationally at the World Heritage Committee and ICOMOS and IUCN to really take the next step in terms of integrating culture and nature in terms of World Heritage and in terms of, again, IUCN and ICOMOS. As we move forward in respective organizations, Parks Canada being one example, I think this concept of having one bold vision with one team, one voice, one vision is critical. I think because again, as we're trying to achieve this integration of visitor experience, conservation, and education, and integration also of culture and nature, it's a way to bring all of our team members together towards common goals. And as leaders, we have to be bold, and it's probably the most challenging part of being a leader is develop that vision. There's no school that prepare you for that. This is about listening to your teams, acknowledging the past in terms of relationship with Indigenous people, and charting a positive future where each team member and each stakeholder externally and internationally can buy in and move forward. I think as we develop that mission and that vision, it's the second element that's critical is to share that passion and share that leadership. And again, this is the example of pulling on that rope on the totem pole in Guayanas National Park Reserve in Haida Heritage Site. But it's about sharing that passion, sharing the leadership, and making sure that nobody's left behind. It's about building part of an exceptional team and building those relationships one by one. I think as we look at building relationship and healing broken connections with Indigenous people, it starts at the top. It starts by leaders that have the courage to meet with Indigenous leaders and elders and listen and learn from the stories of the past and the challenges and the not so good part of our history as a country. It's about spending more time listening and then working and delivering on the commitments that you make to them. And it's about leaders that engage their teams in terms of developing this culture, internal culture of support for Indigenous employees, but also this culture of Indigenous respect that's ingrained in all of our team members. That's the way we're going to be successful long-term. We can all make bold commitments, but those commitments are delivered at the ground level at each World Heritage Site and National Park and National Historic Site by our team members. It's about giving people a real voice in terms of how we manage those areas. It's about Indigenous people being co-managers of those areas, having a say. And I dream of the day where all of our national parks are co-managed to the extent that the chiefs of local Indigenous communities and ministers have the same authority. The day where part of the naming of all of our national parks in Canada reflect Indigenous peoples, a place where young Indigenous people are reconnecting with the land, supported by elders. As I close down to leave time for my colleagues, I want to thank you for the time today and really looking forward to having a great discussion and answering questions. Again, in closing, I've been privileged to be part of an exceptional team in Parks Canada of people, leaders that have made an exceptional contribution to our country. And as we move forward, we need to always remind ourselves of the past and heal that past, but we also have to be bold as we develop action plans and strategies to engage the broader constituency of Canadians. So these places that are so critical to our future are protected for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Our next speaker this afternoon will be Ernesto Enkerlin-Hoeflich. He is best known for his tenure as Mexico's Director of Protected Areas from 2001 to 2010. In that capacity, he profoundly changed that institution. Under his leadership, Mexico achieved the most international protected area designations in its history. He is Emeritus Professor of Ecology and Sustainability at Monterrey Tech. He's a prominent Mexican ecologist, conservationist, thought leader, innovator, and winemaker. And we need to talk about that, Ernesto. His experience and contributions and recognition span private, community, civil, and academic, governmental, and intergovernmental organizations with a focus on biodiversity stewardship and sustainability. He's an inclusive leader and convener who's led diverse negotiations related to biodiversity, nature conservation, human well-being, and climate change. Ernesto, take it over.
Thanks very much. I'm really honored to be in such a company. It's been an inspiration. So I'll share very quickly with you a little bit about me, so you see where I'm coming from, and then I'll give you some of my thoughts. I decided to go without slide support, but bear with me. Well, first of all, I want to share an anecdote. Very early in my career, my boss, the secretary, had just been ousted, and the World Parks Congress in South Africa was coming up. And so I was told not to go because when I returned, I would be without a job. And I said, well, if I don't go, I'm without a job right now. So I went ahead and took the risk of not paying attention to my political advisors and just going with my heart and my passion that was just mentioned by Alan. And it was really one of the wisest decisions in my life because I went on to stay on another 7 years as head of our park agencies, of our single park agency, which is the National Commission on Protected Areas. And at the Protected Areas Leaders Forum, I had the huge privilege of meeting Bob Stanton and Alan Latourelle all on the same day. And I was going to surprise Bob with this because I think I have never shared it with him. But I was just a young Turk. Maybe Bob doesn't even remember me from then because we later met several times. But I approached him because I was having second thoughts about my continuity as Mexico's Protected Areas leader. And I asked him a question, and I did it also to Alan's predecessor, by the way. And they both told me, but Bob was particularly inspiring to me, that you needed 5 years to leave a mark. So from that point on, I said that I needed to stay at least 5 years. And then he also said to let go after 10. So I followed his advice and I left when I was 9.5 years into the job, that I thought I had done what I could do. So standing on the shoulders of giants, shortly after I met Jon Jarvis, And then when we became friends, we dubbed ourselves the Three Amigos. And we were very lucky because politics are very treacherous to stay in our posts for several years, which I think were great years for conservation and for collaboration. And to me, it really humbled me because our agency was just brand new. And we had almost a century in the US and Canada of experiences of mistakes, of good things and of rough things. And so it was really, really, really inspiring. And it gave me a lot of force to return. I never visited a park in South Africa, but I came with a lot of energy out of the World Parks Congress. And 11 years later, I was one of the co-chairs of the World Parks Congress in Australia. So really, I feel very, very privileged of having been there that day. And my thanks go not only to my friends, but all the very impressive teams that we have all over the world. Not only the US and Canada, but I'm a North American, and I have two Native American chromosomes, by the way, but all the rest come from Spain or Germany. At any rate, so I love the way that we call a World Heritage in Spanish or in Mexico, because we call it humanity's heritage, and I think that it's a more powerful word that goes more to the heart. And I also love this idea that I never realized that it's an old idea in the U.S. that to me all protected areas are cultural sites because they are a product of human culture. And Mexico is very rich in World Heritage cultural sites. And we have 2 mixed sites and 5 natural sites. And I had the privilege of being the head of delegation to get the islands of the Sea of Cortez and the monarch butterfly sanctuaries incorporated into the World Heritage list. And cooperation was instrumental, especially in the case of the monarch butterflies. I was not going to attend the Quebec meeting of World Heritage, and because I know it was a lost cause. So I was we did all our homework, etc., but I thought it was really a very long shot. And then 2 weeks before the meeting in Quebec, I got a call from the chief of staff of President Felipe Calderon. And he just wanted to convey to me that the president was very interested in the monarch butterfly nomination. So I had to fly to Quebec, cancel all my other plans. And thanks to the great collaboration of Assistant Secretary, his name I don't remember right now, who was leading World Heritage for the US at the time, and also my colleagues from Canada, and a very inspiring speech by a woman I don't know to this day from Egypt. We got the monarch butterfly sanctuaries. Mexico basically said, we know there's a lot of risk, but we're willing to take the risk, and we want the world to give us basically the benefit of letting us save. And it's been a huge battle, but I think it was a very good thing. I cried during the speech to thank the inscription. And it's another one of those momentous things. I'm a huge believer in international cooperation, but international cooperation is always in a slump because we have all the pressure of our national problems, the pressure of our constituencies, our national constituencies, the taxpayers, etc. And so we really need to carve out in our agendas and have that disposition, because conservation is about interconnection, and we live in a spacecraft Earth, so we need to be very, very involved internationally. There is no other way to do it. So I'm really happy that that we're still talking about the possibility, for example, of an international World Heritage Site along Pinacate with the US, or Maderas del Carmen and Big Bend National Park. I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. International sites are a country's sort of scorecard before the world. So I think it's very important to have international scrutiny in what we do with this, which is humanity's heritage under Mexican or US or Canadian or whatever stewardship. But it's really, we accept to nominate them as part of the world's heritage, and then we have to take responsibility and bear the consequences of not complying. So I think that we need to create opportunities when there's no opportunities. As I said before, international needs to be, we need to carve a particular spot for that. And when the stock is going up, you might be losing, and when the stock is going down, you might be winning. So in international cooperation and in protected areas and conserved areas, I think that we should always have a strategy to be winning no matter how the market is behaving. And we need to have this passion and act a little bit like some of the remarks that Alan had, and I'm sure it's gonna come up again with Jon. But we need to create opportunity. We have to be like children in a little way of not taking no for an answer, and always strive to do this, because it's not only something that's passionate to us, but it's also our obligation, and it's a sense of duty. So I want to thank all the international community. I've been part of it for almost forever, and I feel very privileged, and to all the teams in Mexico, the US, Canada, and all over the world who wake up every morning trying to save our world's heritage. A big abrazo, and thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. Our next speaker is a man I know very well because I worked for him for a number of years. Bob Stanton, Robert Stanton, Mr. Stanton to everybody that knows him, was the 15th director of the National Park Service from 1997 to 2001. He was senior advisor to the Secretary of the Interior from 2009 to 2014. And he was a member of the Federal Advisory Council on Historic Preservation from 2014 to 2020. He is scholar in residence at the University of Missouri and a board member of World Heritage USA. Under his leadership as director of the Park Service, major resource preservation programs were inaugurated, including the Natural Resources Challenge, Save America's Treasures Program, and the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom initiative. Bob started his Park Service career in Grand Teton National Park in 1962. Mr. Stanton, over the course of his 35-year Park Service career, held key positions including Park Superintendent, Regional Director, Associate Director, and Director. He received the Department of Interior's Distinguished Service Award, the Student Conservation Association Founders Award, and IUCN's Fred Packard International Award. I will say as an aside, Fred Packard was the first director of the Park Service International Affairs Office and was chief executive of the National Parks Association. I knew Fred very well before he died. Bob Stanton was a senior participant for the U.S. government in the 5th World Parks Congress and the First World Conference on Cultural Parks in 1984, the Second World Parks Congress in Yellowstone in 1972. From 2001 to 2003, Bob served as the IUCN ambassador for the 5th World Parks Congress. In 1976, Bob hired our next speaker into the Park Service. He was also my boss for 4 years, but then no one gets all their decisions right. Bob, take it over. Good to see you as always.
These national treasures are in reality a heritage of all mankind. They are a gift of those who prize the national world and its healing influence. Stuart Lee Udall, Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior, speaking before the first World Parks Congress in 1962 in Seattle, Washington. Thank you very much, Destry, for that gracious introduction. And let me hasten to thank you, Doug, Ariana, and all the members of World Heritage USA for your kind invitation for me to join in this very special webinar. And certainly to be with my friends and colleagues of long standing, Alan and Ernesto and John, with whom I've known and worked with for 50 years, if you will. It's just an honor to be with you. And for us to speak about the importance of preserving our collective heritage, both natural and culturally, it's difficult to restrain ourselves to a time limit, but I'll try. But I want to again commend all responsible for this webinar. Permit me to share with you very briefly a few perspectives and suggestions in terms of how we may continue to travel on this noble journey in preserving for the benefit of not only this, but future generations, that which we have inherited and that for which we are responsible for passing on to others. As I said before, it's difficult to constrain my comments and observation to a given time frame, having been associated, as Destry mentioned, with national parks, starting as a seasonal ranger in Grand Teton National Park. So I'm celebrating my 60th anniversary of my first experience of entering a national park, and consequently it was bitten by the bug and it is still with me. But respectfully, let me take care of a little business at the outset. I trust that a number of my friends and colleagues have joined us for this presentation and discussion. And knowing them as I do, many of them are beginning to take bets. And the bet is this: when is Bob Stanton in his remarks going to reference Mr. Frederick Douglass? Because they know that Mr. Douglass and I share a compassion for freedom and justice, and that Mr. Douglass's legacy burns deeply within me. And I often say that Mr. Douglass and I met the National Park Service in the same year. And people look at me and say, Bob, I know you're old, but I didn't know you were that old. Here's the point. I donned a green and gray, the color of the National Park Service uniform, as I mentioned before, in 1962, June. And on September 5, 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed a bill into public law authorizing the Frederick Douglass home as a unit of the National Park System. So Mr. Douglass and I have been on this journey for a long time. And I will just continue on Mr. Douglass before I proceed with my other remarks for my friends who were placing those bets. We must be reminded, in the words of Mr. Douglass, that all progress is born of a struggle. And if there's no struggle, there's no progress. So I would ask you, my dear friends, stay in the struggle. Stay in the struggle for justice, equity, and dignity for all. Make Mr. Douglass proud. Make me proud. Thank you very much for that. When we think about World Heritage Sites, think about our stewardship responsibility, obviously we think about how are we caring for the resources entrusted to us. And certainly within the U.S. National Park system, there are 19 of the 24 World Heritage Sites here in the United States. They represent the magnificent natural and cultural heritage that we enjoy. Some represent the magnificent beauty, the biotic communities of Yellowstone, Yosemite, and certainly the cultural sites of the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island. They all bring into focus that which we are grateful and that for which we have a perpetual stewardship responsibility. But when I think about World Heritage Site, it certainly denotes the responsibility of collaboration and cooperation across international boundaries. It has been the goal and it has been the annual objectives of the National Park Service to extend its knowledge, its technical expertise, and through some funding mechanism, as approved maybe by the State Department, the World Bank, and others, financial assistance have been made to our counterparts in other parts of the world. Likewise, the Park Service has benefited tremendously from the knowledge, the expertise, the proven methods of preserving natural and cultural resources from parks throughout the world. So it has been a reciprocal, and it will continue to be a reciprocal relationship. And I would just encourage all who are involved in resource preservation to learn and to share across international boundaries. And in that, as an example, we, in addition to the 19 heritage areas, there are multiple sister park relationships where that individual park, even though they may not be considered a World Heritage Site, they are developing continuing dialogue and staff exchanges across international boundaries. I believe perhaps it's in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 sister park relationships, including sister park relationships with Canada and with Mexico. And again, that's another way of extending ourselves relative to cooperation and collaboration. And I would encourage those relationships to continue. But as we think about the importance of preserving our resources, I was very much encouraged by the bipartisan endorsement here in the United States of a new program that Destry referenced, with the Natural Resource Challenge, which provides a tremendous framework for our trying to achieve the best stewardship, the best care of the natural resources entrusted to our care. And that has become a framework in which we base the level of cooperation and collaboration across international boundaries. But for instance, in better managing endangered species, what are the best practices in terms of managing invasive species? How best to involve outside organizations in the stewardship of the resources, citizens, scientists, if you will, and other kinds of relationships that draws upon the strength of our respective parks and other protected areas. But in doing so, we have to be mindful, I believe, in terms of the history of these parks, not only the World Heritage Sites, but all our parks. For a long period of time, unfortunately, as we have agreed today, that we only dealt with some primary themes that perhaps were set forth in the enabling legislation of some of our parks, or the presidential proclamation if they were established under the Antiquities Act 1906 here. but we did not really scratch the surface until to really determine what were some of the other events or activities, good, bad, or indifferent, that may have taken place on that same land or in that same general area that may have been in a multiple state way. For instance, I take Yosemite as an example. Are we been as forceful in telling the full story of the American Indians who enjoyed that area and perhaps were displaced at the time that it was established as a protected area? Speak about the role of the Buffalo Soldiers in preserving Yosemite. What was the attributes of the ill-given effects of farming and ranching in the Yosemite Valley? What were some of the other circumstances that tell the full story about how that land has certain values and certain significance to different groups or different individuals? We're beginning now to employ what the historians and the archaeologists and others call the layering of history at a given area. And sometimes we have to determine through this re-examination that there are some difficult stories, some sad experiences that may have taken place on those lands. We have to be honest in documenting and being able to tell the full story, the truth, but to all those who have been affected through the management of those lands over the years. And we're beginning to do that in a more forceful way. And that is the same thing that I've experienced in my international travel. Search of the truth and been willing to tell the truth to the public in that given community, that given country, and what have you. So I'm proud of that. And allow me just a personal reference on that. I owe a great deal of gratitude to Alan and Ernesto in terms of their country, rendering aid to my ancestors, resulting from the very insidious act called the Fugitive Slave Act, which in essence dictated that you could not be free even though you may have escaped to a state that has been determined as being a non-slave holding. But under that insidious act, you as a quote unquote owner, you could go to that state and capture me and bring me home. So I had to go to Canada. I should say my ancestors had to go to Canada or to Mexico. And those two countries welcomed my ancestors, gave them a new breath of freedom. So from a personal perspective, Alan and Ernesto, thank you, and thank your fellow countrymen for coming to the aid of my ancestors during those difficult chapters in our collective heritage. I will close with two areas of importance as we look at how we can better preserve and better sustain our collective heritage. And certainly we are confronted with all kinds of difficulties. There's a commonality in park management, park administration, budget consideration, limited staff, how to better engage indigenous communities, how do we actively engage the broad spectrum of the public whom we're responsible to serve. How do we develop and share the best practices in terms of maintenance, rehabilitation? How do we take care of century-old structures? The list goes on and on and on. But I would ask that my friends and colleagues who are still in the vineyard, and I say this as one who has retired not once, not twice, but I'm on my third retirement. And I looked at my report card the other day, and the best I'm able to come up with is a D-, so I'm flunking my third retirement. But I would ask of two considerations as we look at the future of preserving our collective heritage, because there will be more World Heritage Sites inscribed. There will be more national park units established within the U.S. park system. And I'm sure that's true in Canada and Mexico and other countries throughout the world. So preserving our heritage is not a static process. It's a dynamic process in which our portfolio, as it were, will continue to expand. The two considerations in brief is one is take care of our staffs, take care of our employees. And there are many exchange opportunities from country to country, from state to state, county to county, in which we can contribute to the professional development of our staffs, give them the kind of support, the kind of supervision, mentor them, and they will in fact take care of the resources if we as leaders take care of the men and women who day in and day out care for these resources. Their commitment, their compassion is without limit, but they need encouragement, they need support, and we are responsible as so-called leaders to provide that. But perhaps in the end, my most critical concern in my areas of greatest passion is the increased involvement of our youth in the conservation of their heritage, both in the natural world and in the cultural world. In my judgment, there's no greater investment we can make in sustaining the future preservation of our heritage than in our youth. We must take into account new technologies and ways of learning unheard of years ago. We must bear in mind that our youth have access to more information than ever before, and in ways not yet imagined. In the age of growing cultural diversity, we must ask ourselves whether the ways in which we preserve our past and tell these stories are meaningful to our young people, indeed to all citizens. One of the greatest accomplishments as a nation, it seems to me, is that we have come to recognize that our legacy is about learning and teaching, helping our youth find a better life and a better place because we have been here. We have made our contribution. The late preeminent historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin, who served as the chairman of the National Park System Advisory Board when I was the director, he made this observation. The National Park Service, and I would think this be true of our counterpart agencies across the world, is an educational institution, a cultural institution. It can be the most flexible and the most powerful teaching institution that exists. The strength of its position that it teaches in real places about real history and real nature with real things. So again, I think those of us who are in the position of authority and responsibility have an obligation to contribute towards preparing the future stewards. We won't be around forever. So to the extent that we can invest in these new stewards early on, we are preparing the new workforce, the new stewards. But over and above that, if early on people develop an environmental ethic, an appreciation of their natural and cultural heritage, they will take that with them as they become a member of the Senate, the president of a bank, a grocer down the store, a carpenter, a plumber. They will still have an environmental ethics. That is something I believe in passionately. I have met many outstanding environmentalists, conservationists, preservation leaders such as my fellow panelists and Doug and Destry. But there's one gentleman with whom I would have loved to have met in terms of being engaged in international affairs. He spoke to a IUCN conference some years back. He's a noted ecologist from Senegal, Baba Dione. And he made this observation. It's fairly straightforward, but it's profound. It is profound. And I would leave it with you. I quote, "In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand. And we understand only that which we are taught." You, my friends, you, my fellow stewards, will all teach us. Let us go forth and teach about the importance, the values of preserving our world heritage and all other protected resources that we have inherited. We have an obligation to pass on to future generations. Go forth and teach, my friends. Go forth and teach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Inspiring, as you always are. Our next speaker is my brother. Jon Jarvis was the 18th director of the National Park Service from 2009 to 2017. He began his career, thanks to Bob Stanton, on the National Mall in 1975 as a seasonal interpreter. He was a law enforcement ranger at Prince William Forest Park and also in Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas. He was a first inaugural class member of resource management specialists at Crater Lake National Park, and then chief of resource management at North Cascades National Park. Moved on to his first superintendent job at Craters of the Moon, his second superintendent job at Mount Rainier, at Wrangell St. Elias, and then to Mount Rainier. Then he was regional director and then director for the 8 years of the Obama administration. Jon, take it away.
Thanks, Destry. And again, it's an honor to be with these extraordinary giants of the world of conservation. I've immediately already violated one of my principles, and that is to never follow Bob Stanton after he speaks, because he is an inspiration, a hero to all of us for his extraordinary legacy of work in conservation and diversity, in inspiring a new generation as well. So the U.S. Has 24 World Heritage Sites, and most of those managed by the U.S. National Park Service. And I've been to almost all of them in my 40 years with the National Park Service. But I think, to me, their greatest value in many ways is the cooperation that we have internationally. The three amigos, as was mentioned here, Alan and Ernesto and I have worked together along with other world leaders in conservation. And what I have many stories about each of them, Bob Stanton as well, that we could spend all day talking about. But I have been inspired, and I've learned from these extraordinary individuals about my own work in conservation. Occasionally, we take turns leading. And at the Wild Nine conference hosted by Ernesto in Mexico, the National Park Service, the U.S. National Park Service, had basically been absent from the world stage during the administration of George W. Bush. For basically 8 years, we were not on the stage. And Alan and Ernesto remember I walked up to the microphone at this conference and said, "We're back," and the audience rose. And it was a reminder of how valuable the international cooperation is in World Heritage conservation. I did have, as Destry mentioned, the opportunity and privilege to serve as the superintendent of Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska, which is a World Heritage Site. And it is one that we share with Canada, with Kluane and the Alsac-Tatshenshini protected areas as well, making it one of the largest land-based World Heritage areas in the world. And really it was from inspiration from Alan's work in Parks Canada that we began really to invest in and understand the role of Indigenous stewardship for these places, that without recognition, without co-stewardship, without embracing the history, the thousands of years of stewardship of Indigenous people, these places are not as rich, they're not as important, they're not as culturally valuable as they could be when we really embrace First Nations and Indigenous stewardship by leaders like Katie John, who basically stood up to the state of Alaska and resulted in the takeover by the federal government of subsistence throughout the state of Alaska. Our World Heritage sites stand, obviously are protected in of themselves, like Yosemite National Park, but they are symbols for the world, for conservation. And they are also symbols for learning. Yosemite obviously was established by removal of the native Miwok people who found the valley as their home. And slowly, by learning from other nations, the National Park Service is beginning to bring back co-stewardship, bring back traditional ecological knowledge into these areas so that we can manage them cooperatively with people who lived there long before we came in and created these ideas of national parks. Our cultural parks that are World Heritage in the United States also carry symbolism for the world. Independence Hall, basically where the United States declared its independence from a monarchy, stands as a representation for the world about pushing back against autocracies that continue to rise and nations that desire to find a path towards democracy and equal rights. Places like Independence carry those kinds of symbols. And the Statue of Liberty reminds us that we should be a nation, as all nations are, that welcome those who seek a better life, that are escaping the challenges of climate change or political violence or economic suppression, all of those things, that the Statue of Liberty is a symbol not only for the United States, but for the world, that we need to rethink our idea about how we are a world community as well. I did have the opportunity as director to support the reopening of the tentative list and the nomination and designation of a few new World Heritage sites within the United States. Poverty Point being in Louisiana, really representing the extraordinary civilization of Native Americans, basically built earthworks that rival anything around the world, and truly needed to be recognized in the World Heritage System for this extraordinary work by our Native people. And the designation of a marine World Heritage area, Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, established by President Barack Obama and then designated as World Heritage Site, really represents for the world that our marine areas also need to be protected, just like our terrestrial environments, for all of the benefits to the people as well. And then most recently, San Antonio Missions, where it isn't just a story of missionaries and Catholic churches and architecture across the west of the United States, but also the impact that had on Native people and our willingness and ability to tell the story, the downside, the dark side of destruction of culture, destruction of language, the taking of lands, the basically enslavement of Native people is all part of this kind of story that is important to tell within our World Heritage System. So really the bottom line is we learn from each other. We gather periodically now, maybe we can get back together after years of COVID to work with our colleagues, to share ideas, to figure out complex issues. I used to say that our World Protected Area Leadership Forum was the park director self-help group, where we would get together and commiserate about our various challenges and truly share the challenges it can be to be a leader of a large protected area system. And I want to reemphasize that the borders are artificial, that these lines that were drawn on the map for political reasons between us and Canada or us and Mexico are frankly irrelevant. They're irrelevant to conservation. They're irrelevant to culture, to people. They're purely political lines. And in many ways, our community is the one that can lead a different view of these places and how we cooperate, how wildlife moves back and forth, how we work together with the real challenges to the planet, like climate change. And this work carries on, like my friend Bob Stanton, and probably all of us, we're all failing in retirement. We're all working in different venues, different places as volunteers and others to continue this work, to build park systems around the world, such as my work in China and my work at the University of California, Berkeley, to really inspire a new generation to step forward and take on this leadership. And when Alan and I were together in 2016 at a conference, and it was called Inspiring the Next Generation. And it was the usual typical crowd of old white guys, all in the audience, with a small group of young, diverse conservationists in the back corner. And after Alan and I did our little talk and we got our plaques, one of those young people came up to me and sort of got in my face. And she said, "Director Jarvis, we appreciate what you are doing to inspire our generation. But what are you doing to empower those of us who are already inspired?" And then she leaned in really close and she said, "You need to let go. You're hanging on to the leadership of the conservation movement. And we want you to lead an intergenerational handoff of power." And this has been an inspiration for me ever since, that all of us who have carried this mantle of responsibility for now 40 or 50 years need to be empowering this next generation, as Bob said. And there are extraordinary young people out there that are ready to take on this mantle. And the lessons that we have all learned that we can share and inspire them with, and then hand off that power so that they can take on the role of inspiring and giving hope to the planet. Thank you.
Always good there, Brother John. He failed to mention that we've written a book together, published this year, University of Chicago Press.
I'll let you make that plug.
National Parks Forever. It recounts our respective 50 years of park activities inside and outside the U.S. National Park System. So we have a couple of really fundamental questions from the audience that I can throw out to whoever wants to go first. Gary Bremen at Biscayne National Park notes that at Chittagong, India, a stone sign reads, "Sustain your heritage and feel glorious." He's visited 79 World Heritage sites around the world. It says, "It seems to me that there is less emphasis on the importance of the designation in the US than there is in other countries. Why is that? And what is being done to raise the profile of the designation?"
Destry, as I recall in some of the early discussions that you and Doug and my fellow panelists had, I think we recognize that as well. I think there is a general understanding and appreciation of the national parks, but the designation itself of a World Heritage Site, I don't believe that it's a term that's used frequently in a given kitchen or dining room, and maybe there is a need to emphasize it. And I think what I would encourage is that when we talk about the World Heritage Sites, and I hold to the belief that it should be, when we talk about any protected area or any national park, regardless of the countries, that they are exemplars. They are really the standard barriers in terms of preserving and imparting the significance of these areas. So I think there is room for us to expand the general public awareness, nationally or internationally, about the significance of these designations.
Thanks, Bob. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Or we'll,
Yeah.
I wrote very briefly that I think that we need to do a better job of communicating that although these are international designations, they benefit the national interest. I think that it's viewed like if it's something like giving up sovereignty or something like that, because the US or Canada or any country sovereignly decides to become part of World Heritage. So when they are doing that, they're actually doing it in the national interest, but this sometimes is lost along the way. So I think that we need to better communicate that part.
yeah, great. Thanks, Ernesto.
Yeah, if I could jump in, Destry,
Yep.
I think that in the United States, because we have a national park system, the World Heritage designation doesn't carry the same kind of weight that it does in other nations that perhaps have only World Heritage sites and not a national park system. But I think we could do a better job of emphasizing what are the outstanding, remarkable values of a World Heritage site that have international significance.
Yes.
Within the body of our national park system. What are those additional values?
Yeah.
Because you don't really want to say, like in the national park system, that this park is more important than that park.
No way.
Because that gets into a problem. But if you say this park also has these values that are representative internationally, that gives it this sort of additional recognition. And I think we could do a much better job with that.
Appreciate that, John. I agree.
And in Canada, I think we have the same challenge. I think it's interesting that as nominations are being prepared and there's a lot of public input and debates in terms of nominations, World Heritage becomes very prominent. But as soon as the designation occurs, it looks like to me that the concept of World Heritage becomes lost within Canada. Anyways, I feel. But I think part of it is a broader challenge in terms of World Heritage is that there's a lot of expertise internationally to talk about World Heritage, but the management of World Heritage as a collective portfolio and the management challenges from a national institutions like the US National Parks and Parks Canada and so on, there's not a lot of work collaboratively internationally in terms of raising the profile and some of the key management challenges of those places that could help in raising the profile publicly. The profile is very high when organizations are astute in terms of marketing and destination marketing. But for those that are not, then the designation, the World Heritage inscription, it doesn't get the same recognition long term.
Right. You know, we, US ICOMOS, World Heritage USA, had our annual symposium a couple of weeks ago, and it was coincident with what we believe was the first meeting of all of the US World Heritage Site managers since the program began, this being the 50th anniversary year of the convention. And they, that was a great thing that the superintendent from San Antonio Missions organized and had good participation. So it's starting to get recognized again. This pendulum swings back and forth, and depending on the administration as to whether World Heritage is a good thing or an invasion of black helicopters. So right now, it's on the upswing. We think the Congress is going to, if they finish the fiscal 23 budget for the first time in more than a decade, appropriate funding to pay our dues to the World Heritage Center, which several administrations have chosen to withdraw us from UNESCO. We think we'll rejoin UNESCO during the Biden administration. And that's all a good thing to elevate international recognition. One of the other things we want to see done is the Park Service here, and I know in Canada and Mexico, rely significantly on science, some of it university-based, some of it staff, and many World Heritage sites around the world do not have the benefit of a pre-existing national park protected areas or heritage protecting organization. And so we want to find ways where the expertise in our three countries can be provided. Director Stanton mentioned the Sister Parks program. That's one way where we're sharing knowledge. We need to find other ways to benefit countries that don't have the benefit of an agency structure over their World Heritage sites or even over their national parks the way these three countries do. So that's a good thing. One person, Sophia Nicholson, asks, how does the process to be nominated as a World Heritage Site work? I think referring to the tentative list process in each country. John mentioned reopening it here. So maybe say a word about why was it closed? And Alan and Ernesto, I don't know exactly how your countries pursue the pre-nomination process of what we call the tentative list. So if you could say a word about that from each country perspective, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start just briefly.
Yeah.
That they say take care of what you've got and are resistant to any new designations of any sort. And so there's always a stall for the most part on new national park units, wilderness designations, and suspicion, particularly of international designations, that they are somehow ceding some sort of authority to others. And so there really was a dead stop on new nominations there for a while. And then we reopened it to the process has become much more rigorous to develop a formal nomination and get it through, get it onto the tentative list. There's a great deal of scholarly documentation is required in order to really build the case of why this is important. And it is particularly, I think, for the US to sort of achieve that, in that we're not paying our dues, to really meet a very, very high standard to get new sites on the final list.
I think in Canada, the tentative list versus the nominations, I think on the tentative list, it's very government dependent. What I've seen in the last 2 times that the tentative lists were done, one government was very hands-on and not very consultative. And there's another process that it was a lot more elaborate. And I would say science and knowledge base and indigenous base. With some real experts leading the process to develop the quality of tentative list that I think we all expect. But I think in terms of nominations, there's been a lot of support by successive governments, depending on, regardless of stripes of government, in terms of supporting the nomination process. And Parks Canada has provided a lot of expertise in terms of assisting communities or groups or provincial or territorial government in preparing their nominations. So we've led, I say we, when I was in Parks Canada, for example, for the Rideau Canal, it was mostly led by Parks Canada.
Yeah, we also have a tentative list. The National Commission for Protected Areas is only 22 years old, and but we have a very fine institution that has a long history of collaboration with the U.S., which is our National Institute for Anthropology and History, and they have been responsible for inscribing most of our cultural sites, and they are just like a powerhouse. And natural sites get a shot every 3 years. Because the tentative list is large, so we negotiate, and every 3 years there's a natural site or a mixed site that gets a shot to be on the World Heritage List. And it's a very thorough process. We have a lot of support from civil society organizations, and it's I think we I don't want to say that someone doesn't do it right, but I think that we do a good job with both our tentative list and the process of inscription.
Thank you. So, all of you in one part of your talk or another have mentioned the need to engage youth and the next generation in conservation heritage work. Would you care to mention anything more specific about ways to do that and how it's done? I would say, as an aside, Jonathan and my father was in the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s during the Great Depression in the U.S. Worked in what is now Mount Rogers National Recreation Area in his camp. I've been engaged in youth service organizations as part of my nonprofit work over many years, Student Conservation Association and the National Association of Service and Conservation Corps, of which there's more than 100 nonprofit conservation service corps in the U.S. working with the National Park Service and other agencies. Bob Stanton in particular gave, as director, gave that program a big budgetary boost. And it's continued on into the present administration. One thing that's new and different is on the heritage side, the U.S. Park Service has this National Conservation Preservation Conservation Training Center in Maryland, and there's a program engaging youth in the trade skills, the hands-on trade skills of preservation work that's getting filtered out across the system, because so many of the craftsmen, the preservation carpenters and stone and metal masons are aging out and retiring, and there hasn't been a system to replace those skills. So that's starting to be improved here. Any other thoughts on how to get the next generation engaged?
Destry, I appreciate the comment. Couple of thoughts. One is I have been encouraged about the increase on the part of the private sector, nonprofit conservation organizations, governmental entities at all levels, of expanding the opportunities for our young people to work as employees. And of course, in the United States, we have the benefit of the YCC, the Youth Conservation Corps, that allows the federal government to hire youth at the tender age of 15 to participate in hands-on conservation activities. And over the years, there's been a tremendous expansion of youth engagement. But that's only a part of it. I think can get large numbers, but it's a question about the quality of experience that they're getting. If in fact you have a crew that is assigned to an individual who do not have sensitivity or who do not want to take that extra step to teach and to explain to the youth, they can really turn them off about seeking career opportunities in conservation. And I would tell you this as a personal example. When I first worked in Grand Teton, and this was pre-Civil Rights Act of '64, so there weren't many African Americans, particularly in the workforce. So these were some difficult times. But my chief ranger was one who mentored me. He went out of his way to encourage and counsel African Americans. And so he had a great influence on me to ultimately seek a career in the National Park Service. So when we talk about expanding youth opportunities, we have to embrace them. We have to mentor them, encourage them. And they may say, hey, you know, that is a professional. He or she is committed. They're passionate about stewardship. And maybe I want to be like them. And this particular chief ranger encouraged me in that fashion. And to give you some idea of the quality of that person, he became a director of the National Park Service, Russell E. Dickerson. And allow me to just piggyback on on having the airtime here. In my comment, I mentioned about Stuart Udall in his opening remarks at the First World Parks Congress. He also announced that he had authorized to be established within the National Park Service, the Office for International Affairs. So that office celebrated its 60th anniversary this year. So I want to commend Steve and Ron and Rudy and others in that office for the magnificent job that they're doing in coordinating and sponsoring international park affairs. And lastly, Destry, allow me very, very briefly to comment on something that I think we all share, is that we are maturing as a people, as a nation, as a world, to the extent that we can recognize the truth. But we have a ways to go. And with the San Antonio mission, we tell about some of the difficulties there in terms of the treatment of American Indians, people of Spanish heritage. We have to tell the truth. In our national park system, we talk about Manzanar, a Sand Creek massacre. I go to South Africa, where I experienced Robben Island and sat in the jail, where the prisoner Nelson Mandela was incarcerated. But I just leave you this thought, again, from one of my heroes, the late Dr. Jon Jarvis. He said that the places that we preserve or otherwise commemorate difficult chapters in our collective history are not places in which we should allow ourselves to wallow in remorse, but rather be moved to a higher resolve to become better citizens. So in the end, my friends, that is why we have these protected areas we call national parks, World Heritage Site, in hope that we can live up to our destiny, that we will become better citizens. We haven't got to go yet, but we need to become better citizens.
Okay, unless somebody wants to try to top that statement. I thought not, nor do I. It's been great to see you all. This was, I think, exactly what we wanted to do. Leave the audience and the world. The recording will go up on our website shortly, so that this will spread to more people than the 100 or so that we had today. And we thank you all very much for your time and effort that was put into preparing for this. Great to see you all. Take care.
Thank you, Destry and Doug and Ariana. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's back to you, Doug.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of the amazing presenters. It's really a great honor to have all of you here. And I'd also like to thank Destry Jarvis, who's our vice president, for so ably moderating the discussion. He's a terrific moderator, obviously. And I'd like to also thank Ariana Stark-Zarkowski for pulling together all the technological strands, and there are many of them needed for this webinar. I'd like to invite all of you to visit the World Heritage USA YouTube channel, where this webinar will be posted probably by next week, I think. And please feel free to share it with those who might find it useful in a variety of venues, including university courses, places that teach or continuing education programs with which they're involved. I'm sure that they would find this content very engaging. Also, please Google World Heritage USA, visit our site. You'll find a link to this and other YouTube channel webinars that we put on. And while you're there, of course, I invite you to become a member as we pursue the development of a new inclusive heritage that will bridge the perceived nature-culture gap, promote social and environmental justice, re-engage with Indigenous heritage groups, act in support of rejoining UNESCO, as has been mentioned, and to support the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. With that, I thank you all for participating and for watching. And until we meet again, stay well, and please do stay in touch. Thank you.